And thank you to everybody here at the TriStar Group. Definitely appreciate the opportunity to come out here and share with you the work that we're doing down in Texas. Is this clicker open? Okay. I have no financial disclosures, but I am coming from Dallas, so is this the, I do not have Ebola. I am anti-Ebola. There's no Ebola here. Okay. So that's, I'm from UT Southwestern, that's THR Presby, that's been in the news. So what I do usually get asked to speak about is my area of interest is telemedicine, telestroke, and we are going to get there with nurse-driven acute stroke care, what we call NASCAR. But to me, it's a chapter in the telemedicine story. And if you just kind of bear with me, I'd like to kind of give you the context by which that I, as a neurocritical care doctor with an interest in telestroke, do spend so much time on this work. So kind of going back in terms of telemedicine history, if you define telemedicine just as the use of any telecommunications device in healthcare, in its delivery or the treatment of patients, then it really goes back to the Civil War with the telegraph. 1860s, we were first starting to use the telegraph to communicate casualty lists and medical supply chain. And then as telecommunications devices have sort of rolled on, so has telemedicine. We just quite didn't know it. The telephone is an example of telemedicine every time you use it for the purposes of healthcare. The 1960s with the NASA program, that's probably the first instance when you actually had equipment purposely designed to communicate telemetry information across very large distances. And in the 70s and 80s was actually the first time that we had telemedicine oftentimes the way we think of it now, with the use of high-quality two-way audio-video connections with psychiatry programs in the Midwest. But a lot of those programs did flounder because of a lack of financial viability. We're now at a place where we have multiple vendors now providing telemedicine solutions. So if you did see the booth just outside with InTouch Health, they're based in Santa Barbara, and I did have the opportunity to visit them at their headquarters. And these pictures here really sort of illustrate how far we've come in such a short time. On the left, you have the original sort of prototype, and you see sort of all the concept basically there. This is a navigable robot that you can move around. It has a high-quality camera on top, high-quality screen, and then on the very right there is actually kind of with its head down, that's the RP Vita. This is InTouch partnering up with the people at iRobot, the people who make the Roomba vacuum. And this thing actually has a map of your hospital in its brain, and you just tell it which room to go to, and it navigates there by itself. It's pretty neat stuff. If you jump out in front of it, it knows to go around you. It's really neat. And then, of course, then we have Google Glass. I think everybody's excited about this. This could work on both ends, both at a remote location or for perhaps a physician as they're working on in the OR to have electronic information being there readily available to you. But this is a concept that, kind of borrowing from Marketing 101 from business school, this is the technology adoption life cycle. It's a bell curve, and basically on the very left there you have the 2.5% of the population who are the innovators, the dreamers, the visionaries, the people who kind of think of these crazy ideas to begin with. And then the next 13.5% of the population, you have the early adopters. And sometimes it's those, I like to think maybe that's for those of us who are in academics, we're the ones running those pilot trials. But then you have this thing called the chasm. And for marketing people, this is how do you push a great idea or great product across to the majority of people, the early majority, the late majority, and finally the laggards. And for telemedicine, how do we move from a bunch of cool stuff to a paradigm of patient care that actually makes sense? So kind of examining the telestroke story a little bit more closely, the You know, it was great to actually hear from Dr. Gupta and Dr. Gibbons this morning because I think they really did a nice job of outlining some of the problems that we all know for those of us who are sort of neuro-oriented. Acute stroke treatment, we have a great medication. We can't de-emphasize the role of TPA. It still is the only FDA-approved medication for the treatment of stroke. And we heard from Dr. Gibbons about all the mechanical thrombectomy options. But we don't really do a great job of delivering this care. And the primary reason being that acute stroke management still is quite dependent on the neurological exam. And there is no biomarker, there is no ST elevation for stroke. So in 1999, Levine and Gorman, they were neurologists at Michigan State. They coined this term, telestroke. And they wrote up a conceptual sort of proposal about what they thought that this should look like. And this is the actual sketch from that paper. And the basic concept is there. So it's basically a camera that records the patient encounter. You get a remote CT scan, and then a neurologist who is not at that location reviews both and makes a decision. Considering that this was 1999, and if you think back to that time, I mean, this is before smartphones. This is before anybody heard of Google or Apple the way it is now. They sort of really amazingly did sort of ask all the right questions in terms of whether we could pull telestroke off. From a technological, legal, political, financial, and medical perspective. And we'll kind of get into how we've done with that. I did train at Duke, and being in North Carolina, did have a chance to collaborate with our colleagues over at Wake Forest. And Dr. Chuck Tagler, these are his maps. He assiduously puts these together over the years, and it's sort of a great demonstration about the explosive growth of these networks. In October 2010, in North Carolina, you had the first two players to sort of enter the market, both located in Forsyth County. They're competitors. So that's Wake Forest and Forsyth Medical. About 18 months later, you had the entry of Mission Health in the western part of the state. Duke, we were starting to get our act together there in the sort of the northern part of the state. And then you could see even as far to the sort of the coastal regions in Carteret and Brunswick counties, Wake Forest and Forsyth were already sort of making some headway to there. And this is the last map I have from Dr. Tagler, which just shows you the sort of continued growth and penetrance of this paradigm of care. And so where are we today? Telestroke 2014, 15 years later, in sort of analyzing all those questions that Levine and Gorman posed. So from a technological standpoint, the feasibility, I think this is definitely a check. There's multiple telestroke vendors out there. There's multiple solutions. A lot of people do it a lot of different ways, but we certainly can do it. And it did take a lot of sort of data out there in the literature to sort of validate that you could do the NIH stroke scale over telecommunications, that you could do this kind of safely from a medical standpoint. And technologically, we're okay. Legal, I gave this a check. In terms of licensing and liability issues, certainly people do it. However, the American Telemedicine Association in 2014 did just release a report last month sort of grading all the different states about their telemedicine laws. Texas got an F for one of our laws that requires that if you do telemedicine, you have to be in a designated telestroke center or telemedicine center, and that those patients require 1-year follow-up. So very restrictive, so not the best kind of thing. Tennessee is great. Got sort of straight A's across the board, I believe. So Tennessee, awesome. You get to do whatever you want here. Political, I think this is an accepted paradigm of care, especially with neurologists and the ER community. The sort of initial skepticism there about the liability issues, I think, have sort of vaporized over the years. Financially, this is still being worked out in terms of reimbursement. However, as you've seen sort of in just the map of North Carolina, this is something that hospitals are sort of heavily incentivized to do. Especially as the networks grow, you sort of capture the referral market that goes along with it. So it does make sense on a hospital level. For the physicians, it also does financially make sense. There are sort of reimbursement schema despite the lack of insurance billing. And that is also continuing to get worked out. But where I did sort of kind of put a question mark was sort of the medical questions. So even though we've had a number of papers out there in the literature describing sort of the safety and feasibility of these telestroke programs, we haven't had a lot of data about how well telestroke actually works in delivering on its original mission, sort of delivering acute stroke care via stroke specialists to the patients who need it out in sort of the rural communities. And so when I got to Duke a couple of years ago, so one of the questions as I was kind of working with my mentor there, Brad Coles, who was sort of heavily invested in clinical informatics, is this question: if the clinical data in a telestroke encounter is necessarily all being captured in the electronic format, I mean from start to finish, then can we sort of capture this data sort of in a new way? Can we do research? Can we abstract this data that sort of lends itself to sort of new analysis? And so that's what we did. This is a paper we wrote called Targeting Telstroke. It's a play on the American Heart's stated goal, the target stroke goal of having door-to-needle times. So that's patient arrival at the door to getting TPA of less than 60 minutes. What we did, we partnered up with the people over at InTouch Health, and they had a documentation software called Stroke Respond. And so as the neurologists were working through these patient encounters, they were also inputting a lot of this clinical data. And so we had access to 8 networks, and we were blinded to actually who they were. What we were told is that it was a mix of private hospital systems as well as academic. So kind of giving us a real sort of I thought, fair glimpse of what real-world telestroke was actually doing. And we got to take a look at the data. We invented 2 new sort of outcome measures, response time and consult length. Response time we defined as from time from patient arrival to physician log on. And that was data that was captured directly from the robot itself. So what we found was that the mean was 76.3 minutes. For the consult length, so this was the time that the neurologist actually spent on the robot, it was 14 and a half minutes. And this was independent of every clinical variable. The patient could have been 23 years old with no vascular risk factors, and the neurologist invariably spent just about 15 minutes. The only variable that was associated with a longer consult length was if TPA was recommended and delivered. So when I first kind of did this data analysis, I thought I screwed up the whole spreadsheet or something. I was totally confused because reflecting back on my training experience as a junior neurology resident sort of running around, there's no way this could have happened. I was always there pushing along the care. I had a personal best door-to-needle time of 14 minutes. But as I thought about it, that it wasn't really me, it was the system, and there was an entirely different system that was happening with these telestroke encounters. So it wasn't, the stroke specialists weren't logging on at the very outset. They were waiting for all this work to be done offline first. And then after all the sort of requisite data was collected, the stroke physician was logging on and sort of giving the blessing about whether this was a TPA case or not. And so knowing that, it sort of kind of posed the next natural question, is that if there is a totally different workflow going on for telestroke, how do we improve that? So as I sat and thought about it, and the only single person that's consistent from the patient arriving to the door all the way until they leave the ER is the bedside nurse. And it just only made sense to focus on the nurse as being the empowered person, as sort of the driver of care. And so that's how we came up with NASCAR, nursing-driven acute stroke care. And the question is, if we can pit stop a car in 13 seconds, how come we can't run a stroke code faster than an hour? This is everybody's favorite slide. That's the stroke belt on the left, the sort of unexplained 10% increase in mortality in the United States. That's where all the NASCAR tracks are. So I am admittedly actually not a motorsports fan, but I've kind of learned a little bit through this process. And it's fascinating. It really, when you sort of analyze exactly what it is that a pit crew does, it is tremendously athletic, and it is a team sport. You have all these people involved in making this thing happen very fast. So you have 2 tire carriers, people who are dedicated just carrying the tires to and back from the car. You have 2 people who are dedicated to just changing the tire. You have the jack man who has to go from one side to the other. You have a gas man who is has to carry 2 81-pound, 15-gallon tanks of gas and dump that into the car as quickly as possible. You have a support crew and an extra man who I read is their responsibility is to run over to the driver and check in with them. I guess the official's not really part of it, but there's the car chief, the crew chief, as well as the engineer who's making sure that everything's happening to design and specification. So using this pit stop as sort of inspiration, we kind of designed this protocol. So nursing-driven acute stroke care. And we're awarded an initial grant this past year by the University of Texas Health, Safety, and Effectiveness Grants Program. And we piloted it in basically our own ER first. So we have an interesting setup in Dallas where our first telestroke spoke site is actually our own hospital, because all of neurosciences is housed in a separate, smaller hospital called Zale, where all the neurophysicians are. And the main hospital, St. Paul, is where the ER is. And so because of that, we are necessarily locked into a telestroke encounter. And we thought this was a unique opportunity for us to jump in and implement a new QI protocol. And so what we came up with, and this kind of took some time to sort of distill, is what does it mean to run things like a pit stop? And we kind of came up with these 5 principles. 1, identification of shared goals. And so I will say that the whole pilot project has been sort of an enlightening experience for me, and particularly as we kind of move on to the bigger research study. My new research coordinator, Michelle Preventure, she was actually one of the ER nurses who actually ran the protocol as a clinical nurse, and she basically told me all the things that we did wrong, which was kind of humbling, but it was a learning experience. And one of the things that I think watching some of my colleagues deliver stroke lectures to a nursing audience who have such limited bandwidth and so much responsibility and so many different kinds of patients to care for, is that we were delivering sometimes the wrong message. So I was sitting there listening to one of my colleagues talk about the Wallenberg syndrome, something very sort of nuanced, talking about neuroanatomy, and it was just so easy to overcomplicate this message. And it's a very academic phenomena where we just sort of have this verbal diarrhea of all this information without, it's us, particularly neurologists. But it was to really simplify the message. And what were the light bulb moments? So 1 is mock codes. We did this over and over. Once we had the protocol sort of drafted out, we were down there at shift change several times over a couple weeks, kind of really even blocking out exactly where people stood, if they were sort of the secondary nurse or the nurse driver, exactly who was doing what at what stage. We actually took our mock patient over to CT. We were kind of looking down through the checklist and really sort of laying everything out very explicitly and clearly. The other point that I found that was sort of kind of a key point in education was that we've all heard time is brain. And what does that translate to? We heard Dr. Givens actually talk about millions of neurons. And what it really does translate to is life years. And we did see this table already once, but I think it definitely deserves seeing one more time, is this table, this was written by Jeff Saver at UCLA. This is it correlates basically your stroke injury to accelerated aging. So for every stroke that you let sit there and they're hemiplegic and aphasic and they leave your ER without doing anything, hemiplegic, aphasic, they lose 36 years of their life. Right? Per hour, that's 3.6 years of their life that is disappearing in front of your eyes. Per minute, 3.1 weeks. Per second, 8.7 hours. So I think I did hear some wows. This is something significant, and this was sort of I kind of honed in on it. This is the message I wanted to deliver. This was how we were going to get everybody on the same page and equating that lost time is lost life. So what's next? Organized urgency with the removal of gatekeepers. What does that mean? So Julian, the ER docs don't like you. So basically, assigning the nurse driver was sort of to empower the single person, like I said before, the single person who is there from start to finish, to let them, so a lot of places do have a stroke order set, but to let the nurses actually run that order set, unfettered, and can push the patient along. So oftentimes, when I do introduce, as I go around Texas to some of these ERs, the ER docs are the ones that are like, oh, I don't like the sound of this. This sounds like you're continuing to diminish the role of physicians. And it's not that we're sort of de-emphasizing any sort of medical decision-making. It's just that we're executing the protocol that you want as quickly as possible. And it's not necessarily ER docs. Oftentimes it's the CT technician who perhaps hasn't had the opportunity to sit in on all of these stroke lectures, and they have 3-4 cases backlogged, and your stroke code is waiting to get their CT scan. So I think that happens less and less now, but it's sort of this recognition that we are in the middle of a research project. We are running a protocol with a name. I'm the nurse, and this is nursing-driven acute stroke care. Multi-personnel, non-sequential processes. So we all know what a cardiac code looks like, right? There's 20 people, they're all screaming. There's about 19 of them are all waiting to put a central line in the patient. And this is what a stroke code looks like, right? It looks like an outpatient encounter. And so basically it's trying to find the happy point between a cardiac code and a stroke code so that you have multiple people working in parallel, but it's organized and everybody knows what everybody else is doing. And it's a simple concept, but it goes back to those mock codes. It's exactly where are you standing, where am I standing, what am I doing, what are you doing, and where are we on this checklist? So a focus on defined stage roles and tasks. So this is always kind of hard to project on a big screen like this, but this is what we ended up calling the Nascar Run Sheet. So at the top of it is you have sort of your basic demographic data, as well as sort of the identifiers for everybody who's on the care team. And then in the middle section is sort of your checklist of what needs to happen in the stroke code. We ended up, this is the last version that we're working with right now, we have 2 options, and I don't know if you can really read it, but on the left, option 1, you could go directly to CT, sort of the work that's been evidenced by the people at WashU, Andrea Ford, showing the evidence that it's better to go straight from EMS to the CT scanner. However, we know that a lot of institutions can't do that. St. Paul couldn't do that. It's sort of the location of our CT scanner. It was too cumbersome. We would have lost too much time in sort of the confusion of not being able to register the patient and things like that. So there's option 2 in the middle there, where we go directly to the room first, then prep CT and go there second. The right side of the sheet has the sort of running time log of all the key points in the stroke code. And we asked the nurses the nurse driver to collect all the times that when the ED provider is at the bedside, when patient gets to CT, the time at which the NIH stroke scale was acquired, when labs come back. And we've invented this new sort of, in the yellow, is this new sort of time point, which we call ready time, or door to ready. So this is the time point at which all the key variables that you need to make a thrombolytic decision, so that's your NI stroke scale, your labs, your CT scan, and inclusion-exclusion criteria, all those things are done. All the things that the nurse driver is responsible for, the earliest point at which that is completed, and sort of kind of a way to sort of really demarcate what is sort of part of the Nascar protocol versus maybe perhaps some lags in the physician times. Empowered engagement, empowered responsibilities. So this is sort of that right side of that sheet. This is kind of the phenomena that once people knew that they were partaking in a research study and they were personally responsible and they were personally being tracked, that there was a high level of engagement and sort of just a personal incentive to move this patient along through. Some people kind of call that just the Hawthorne Effect, but if the Hawthorne Effect works, why don't we use it? So here's the sneak preview of the pilot study results. So I get to present this in about 4 months in this very building again for international stroke. And admittedly, the data was not that clean. The pilot study, we learned a lot of things. Our original sort of outcome variable was door to TPA time, door to needle time. However, I did not anticipate, being new to the institution, of what poor volumes we actually had. So in the 6 months that we ran the protocol, we actually only pushed the TPA 3 times. And so because we didn't have those numbers, we had to substitute another figure, and we compromised that door to CT was going to be our sort of area of interest. And the numbers for door to CT, you know, you roughly want around 25 minutes, 20 minutes if you're really good. And we showed sort of in the first 3 months of running the protocol that it was about 38 minutes, and as time went on, that dropped to about 27 minutes. However, the significant part was the standard deviation for me. In the first 3 months, we had sort of 58 minutes either way, and 19 minutes after running the protocol for 3 months. And so to me, that was a little bit significant in terms of showing that there was increasing fidelity, recognition of a protocol, and that we were kind of starting to do the same thing the same way every single time. What was more important to me in the fact that we were sort of in a pilot study and a QI mode was sort of these more of these qualitative judgments from the stakeholders. And to me, sort of the biggest endorsement of what we did or are doing is that nursing sort of fully embraced the run sheet, or the driver sheet, as it was called. And the biggest validation of the protocol, I think, is that the nurses and the stroke team just elected to continue on with the driver sheet. It's something that they liked. It's a piece of paper that they could scribble notes on, but also had a guide and could work with. The ED physicians, we saw that their times to responsiveness also dropped from 15.8 to 9.5 minutes. So there's sort of a halo effect across the board with everybody who's kind of working, who touches the patient. Neurologists are always the problem. I know. There was some mixed response to the validity of the nursing performed NIH stroke scale. Some of my colleagues had a problem with that, but they were fully empowered to repeat the NIH stroke scale if they wanted to. We did a kappa analysis. There was no difference between their standardized stroke scale measure versus a nursing performed one. That's why it's standardized. And then there was also some perceived marginalization of resident learning. So being an academic institution, the first version of that run sheet was a little bit more complicated because there were all sort of the resident responsibilities running around. And on top of that, we had the resident and the fellow and the sort of all the things that kind of go with the academic process. Hospital administration, super happy. During the period of the study, we did achieve a historical best for the institution. So one of the 3 TPA cases, we did get door to needle to 32 minutes, and that was right prior to Comprehensive Stroke Center, the survey, the JACO survey. And the surveyors did witness a stroke code going off while they were there, and they specifically commented on the organization of the stroke code protocol. So where do we go from here? We're moving to what we can now call the Lone Star Stroke Research Consortium. So 2 years ago, the state of Texas allotted $4.2 million for tele-research, specifically for stroke. And it's a conglomeration of 6 academic institutions throughout the state, along with their telestroke networks, and it's to move stroke research in every phase from rehab, clinic, to the ED, out into the community, out into the rural areas, places where stroke research hasn't happened before. And as it were, Nascar, we got picked up as the first study to be put throughout this network, and we're currently building this right now. Southwestern and UT Houston will be the first ones to sort of get to work on this. We did reformulate the protocol somewhat. We decided to go with a little bit less gimmick. This was Michelle's sort of telling me that there was a lot of rolling of eyes, as we talked about, nurse drivers and NASCAR and things like that. So a little bit less gimmick. But more importantly, the formal education program. So really highlighting that key message of that time is accelerated aging, time is years. And then we wanted to implement a little bit more carefully measures of attendance capture for our education and what we're doing in terms of the intervention. We realized sort of in hindsight that we probably had fairly incomplete penetrance of what was going on in the ER, as reported to me by Michelle. And then a little bit more direct messaging regarding the study procedures. And we dramatically simplified this run sheet. So overall, what are the goals for what we're doing with NASCAR? It's really to ultimately get to the best practice for how to run a stroke code, especially for those locations that are running telestroke protocols where there isn't a neurologist right there 24/7. And what the really tricky part is, how do you create that mechanism? How do you create a culture change? And reflecting back on the experience of the 6 months this past year, I will give it to you that despite the gimmickiness of it, there is some potency to the power of branding. So that was our original logo up top there, QCI NASCAR. It was called Quality Care Improvement with Nursing-Driven Acute Stroke Care. We wanted to get away from the actual NASCAR name because copyright. And so we kind of settled on this name NASCAR with the hyphen. And the hyphen is very important because if you forget it, it reads NASCAR or NASCARED or NASCARY. But logos and a catchy name do go a long way. So it is about that sort of empowered engagement, empowered responsibility. It's, hey, everybody, we're doing a protocol here, and in the name is nurse-driven. So coming back to this, this is where I spend my time trying to think about how to move across that chasm. And I think this is one of the important areas for us to do, to focus on as we continue to expand all these telestroke networks, is to make sure that the original intent of sort of making sure our acute stroke patients get great care, we don't lose sight of that. What is the future directions from here? I'm getting more and more interested in mobile health. As I was kind of sharing with some of the colleagues here earlier. And I mean, my dream would be if we could somehow get that NASCAR, instead of a piece of paper, if we had this on everybody's cell phones. So the idea, the infrastructure is already built, and there's a lot of people who are already kind of doing similar work. There's an app you can download sort of institutionally called Stop Stroke. And basically, it starts with EMS. As soon as they pick up a patient that they think is a possible stroke patient, they sort of hit the buzzer, and everybody who touches the patient along that stroke code encounter, including the CT tech, the ER doctor, the ER nurse, neurologist sitting at home, their smartphone goes off with a buzz. And it captures all that data, it captures all those metrics, and I think it'll be a powerful tool. So as we move forward, this is I think this is where we're going with everything. So that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Got a question up here.
Have you all integrated any aspects of stroke that occur in a facility into that program? Like, not just the people arriving by EMS, but patients that might already be in your hospital as an inpatient?
Yeah, so for the floor stroke codes, we're doing that right now, actually. So we're taking the original run sheet, and we're adjusting it for a floor protocol. Anybody else? Thank you.